Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So following on in this short series of what if President Trump dies mid-term, I'm going to discuss the implications for Project 2025. Now, this has a few more unknowns than the first video because we don't know quite how Vance views it, even though he seems keen on embedding far-right control into the state. And we also don't know whether he can hold together the various coalitions which are driving the project. But let's give it a shot anyway. But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So Project 2025 is a 900-page instruction manual for completely rewiring the entire federal government. So one switch controls everything. That switch is the president. The plan leans on the most aggressive reading of the unitary executive theory, which is that every bureaucrat from, secretaries of state right down to like park rangers or something are all answerable directly to one person. To make that real, they'd already built a sort of database of 20,000 pre-vetted loyalists and an online academy that trained them so that they could hit the ground running as soon as Trump won the election, as soon as he was inaugurated. Trump began his second term by saying that he, not judges, would interpret the law as it relates to the actions of his office. He's also made executive orders which are not his to give and carried them out as if they were. Courts have tried to rule against them, but he carried on anyway, safe in the knowledge that he cannot be arrested for contempt of court because of the Supreme Court. There was a suggestion that maybe the agents of these illegal orders could be arrested because Trump can't physically carry out the orders himself, but that hasn't happened. So never mind what the Constitution or the law says, Trump has in most practical respects centralised all power to the White House in a fairly clumsy way so far, but he is also working to set new precedents to formalise that centralised power as well. Critics call it authoritarian, supporters call it essential reform, but everyone agrees once it's locked in, you're not going to break it very easily. You change, let's say everything carries on democratically. The midterms are democratic. The House flips again. Let's say the next presidential election's democratic and a Democrat candidate wins. They can't change this overnight because the federal government will be embedded MAGA, right? He's building a medieval fortified town, basically, with the president and the central keep controlling everything. Here's the thing, though. The keep only stands because every stone is cut to fit one keystone, one president who knows the blueprint and wants it executed. If you pull that keystone, the arch wobbles a bit. But what if Trump becomes too ill to continue as president? Under normal rules, of course, the vice president steps in, parties adjust, life goes on. Project 2025 doesn't do normal, though. Power is very tightly wound around the original leader, so much so that a handoff cannot be seamless. It could actually be very chaotic. I mean, let's look at the scenario. So, new president takes the oath, Vance. Day one, the staffer carrying the Project 2025 playbook could be replaced. The database gatekeepers, they're just going to ask one question, right? Are you still running the original agenda? Now, if the answer is yes, they will presumably flip to the backup tab labelled continuity. If the answer is no, say Vance turns out to be a bit more moderate than we imagine, or just wants his own ideas, then the personnel pipeline freezes. Those 20,000 pre-vetted appointments, I don't know how many of them have been made so far, but suddenly they lack that sponsor. Career civil servants, labelled enemies of the state on week one, suddenly are invited back to their desks with no political cover to stop them. Now, I suspect Vance would want to continue with the main aims of Project 2025. He's been spending time, for example, promoting the idea of embedding the same far-right control in Europe. Now, that's not part of his role as vice president or even supporting Trump. That's got nothing to do with Trump's aims. He's doing it off his own back because he seems personally invested in the project of transforming the whole Western world from liberal democracy to far-right oligarchy, not just America. More about that in the next video. But that doesn't mean he agrees with all aspects of Project 2025. It also doesn't mean that even if he did, he can hold all the different groups together who put their shoulders behind it. Because history does give us a bit of a dress rehearsal here. When Stalin died, the Soviet Union then had a hyper-centralized system, just like Trump is trying to build. That Well, that was a bit wobbly for quite a few years while various factions fought for the steering wheel. We cannot assume that MAGA will just automatically swing behind Vance just because he's the one who has to become president. Different leaders may have their own idea about who should lead the cult, even if they accept Vance would have to lead the government. But would they want him to really lead the government or just be a puppet president? And what would Vance think to that? After Stalin, the same structure that had fueled breakneck industrialization nearly triggered civil war because the gears only turned towards one man. This is the thing about having a strongman leader. They don't build a system so much as a power base. These sorts of leaders don't always plan for succession. A bit closer to home for Americans, when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford inherited a White House apparatus built for that full Nixon term. Entire policy tracks were mothballed. Not because Ford disagreed with them and wanted them shelved, but because no one had briefed him on the specifics. He didn't know how to run them. Project 2025 makes that chaos look a bit quaint. We know that even like in a normal country, when a minister or secretary of state, for example, leaves their department, a lot of the policies that have been worked on just get shelved. So the same thing would happen. You know, it would strip out the institutional memory. So only the chosen president and their cadre really know how the machine works. How much, for example, does Vance know about the inner workings of Project 2025? I mean, yes, he knows what the blueprint says, just like I do, because anyone can download and read it, and he will have read it. But in terms of the practical operation, like the nuts and bolts, Trump will have had regular conversations with the architects throughout the last half a year, because he's the one who has to authorise it all. Will Vance have been kept updated on all the details? If not, and they try to bring a newly inaugurated President Vance up to speed, will he believe them when they say, oh, well, this is what we were doing with President Trump? You know, will he give them the authority to carry on because does he trust them? Will there be mutual suspicion that stops the project running smoothly? After all, it's hardly a transparent process. Remember that academy as well. That was training like two cohorts. You had your ideological warriors and your institutional specialists, right? They needed some specialists to actually maintain the function of the state. The warriors are the ones that are completely loyal to the name on that acceptance letter, not really the office. The specialists are the ones who know how to keep the planes from falling out the sky, which they've sort of done, and social security, like checks in the mail, all that sort of stuff, how to actually run the state. In a sudden leadership change, the warriors could well just walk off. The specialists would likely stay. But overnight, that would mean the ratio of true believers to process experts flips. The new president can either staff up with career bureaucrats, which undoes all the work, or risk a government that keeps the lights on but can't pursue Project 2025's goals. Either way, momentum stalls. More than 100 partner organisations signed on to this. Now, anyone who's had anything to do with a committee knows the more people you have in that committee, the longer it takes to agree anything, right? Some of these organisations, they're all about the tax cuts. Some of them are about the abortion bans. Some of them want the Department of Education got rid of, right? The only common denominator really is loyalty to the original architect. If you remove that architect and the coalition fractures along its fault lines, tax cutters might decide the new president is better for markets. Abortion focus groups might sense an opening to push harder. Cue a feeding frenzy. The various groups who came to an accord with Trump about how far he would go may suddenly sense the opportunity to push for more. Outside opponents will watch the chaos and sue over every executive order, knowing that the White House is now busy fighting on several fronts at once. And courts hate whiplash. I mean, sometimes you get a situation where a court will grant a stay to give new administrations times to find their footing, like, where are we going with this, rather than a definitive judgment straight away. A single federal judge could pause the entire playbook on the ground that the new president lacks the mandate of the predecessor. And once one domino falls, other could follow. The unitary executive theory is very potent, but it's quite brittle. If courts decide the president's authority no longer reaches the outer limits claimed by Trump, every agency as part of Project 2025 snaps back to standard rulemaking. The fortress turns into a sandcastle at high tide. Then there's the public. People are generally not that fond of abrupt regime change unless they instigated it. If Project 2025's more controversial moves, say reclassifying tens of thousands of federal workers as political appointees, if that's already rolling and the face of the project disappears, the backlash could be quite fierce. You know, the headlines would flip from bold reform to power grab. In the UK, for instance, there's been in the last year no shortage of Tory media articles complaining about some policy or other, right? And I'm thinking, that's been around for a few years. Why weren't you complaining when the Conservatives were in power? Because they're the ones who implemented it. No, but they didn't complain about it then, but they do now under Labour. Sometimes the way people support or oppose a policy has less to do with the policy and more to do with who's pushing it. Centrist Republicans in the Senate could start edging away, no longer fearing that Vance has the same sort of authority that Trump has. Even friendly pundits could ask if the plan is going too far. The new president reads the room and then quietly shelves the more polarising orders. And in a week, the narrative could shift from unstoppable juggernaut to overreach reversed. And here's the irony. The same centralisation of power that makes Project 2025 so alarming to a lot of us also makes it fairly fragile. Every safeguard is engineered for one will, because there aren't real safeguards. It's like Project 2025 is getting rid of the guardrails and saying like this one person, President Trump, has control of everything. Then he's not there anymore. Who has control? You know, you remove that, the safeguards that they think they've got in place have become tripwires. Every loyalist is picked to obey one voice. That's what 2025 is. It's an operation to make people obedient to a single will, a single voice. But if you silence that voice, the loyalists scatter. Every policy is built for speed, not durability. If you slow the pace, the whole edifice could crack. So Trump's death, or even permanent incapacity, is such an obvious risk to Project 2025. It does make you wonder, have they thought about this? Have they given thought to contingencies? Is Vance included at the very top levels of discussions just in case? Or is he not because nobody wanted to tell Trump that they were planning for his untimely but not inconceivable demise? I can't imagine so many wealthy special interest groups would have sunk so much time and effort and organisation into a project that is going to reform the United States without thinking that maybe a guy in his 70s who loves cheeseburgers and ketchup would have to survive long enough to see it bedded in. So although there are plenty of risks to Project 2025, where if Trump suddenly and unexpectedly dropped out the picture, you would think it could easily collapse, I am also thinking that maybe some thought must have been given to the possibility as well. We don't really know, but let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.